All right, I want to change gears now. Urban decay seems like something one would hear in the 1970s. Millions of people, mostly white people, left cities for the suburbs. So did a lot of jobs, mainly manufacturing jobs. But in the 3 decades since, many cities have been trying to reinvent themselves. There have been success stories. Today's guest probably was ahead of his time for what the urban landscape should look like. Richard Florida has advocated for a creative class to make cities sustainable and successful. Urban theorist, author, and educator Richard Florida joins us on the phone now. Mr. Florida, thank you very much for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I spent nearly 2 decades of my life in the state of Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, where I actually developed this theory. So it's great to be talking to you.
All right, creative class. Who makes up this creative class?
Well, I think you really gave a great introduction to this whole thing, this whole idea we're talking about, this urban transformation we're talking about. 20 or 30 years ago, cities like Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Newark, New Jersey, where I was born, Detroit, Michigan, and many others were completely written off. They were being abandoned by industry, deindustrialized. The previous commentator just talked about the loss of those good-paying, family-supporting manufacturing jobs, like my dad had a factory in New Jersey. But something began to happen, and I think the year is about the year 2000. About the year 2000, we begin to see in America a movement of mainly younger people, mainly college grads, college-educated people, and mainly more affluent people back to cities and urban centers. And of course, that goes like gangbusters in San Francisco and Boston and Washington, D.C. and New York. But it also happens in metro after metro, including Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. And so I think what has driven this is this group I dub the creative class. They're not just highly educated people. They're people who work in science, technology, form companies. They're entrepreneurs. They're people who work in business and management, these knowledge-based professionals. The word yuppie, a young urban professional. But also, one of the key groups in this change are the artists, the designers, the musicians who pioneer urban neighborhoods. So altogether in America, we have about 40 million people. A third, think about this though, a third of our workforce are members of this creative class, while today only 20% of the workforce are members of the old working class, and 6% of the workforce, I think this is important for listeners, only 6% of our workforce today are engaged in making things in factories. So the creative class is kind of the big new class, urban class of our time.
Why are people in this group in a position to contribute to a successful city?
Well, I think the first question is, why did they come back? I think there's several theories. One, they came back because there's more of the kind of jobs they do in the urban core, these knowledge jobs, these high-tech companies, that used to be all out in the suburbs, are now pouring back to urban centers in Manhattan, in San Francisco, in Pittsburgh, and Toronto, where I now live. The second factor is they want to keep their commutes low. Creative class people work with their mind. Time is money. And they want to minimize. They can't afford, that 1.5 to 2 hour brutal commute. The third factor is that increasingly urban areas are safer. They're cleaner. When I lived in Pittsburgh, all the buildings were black. And by the time I left Pittsburgh, all the buildings had been cleaned and were limestone color. Crime is much lower in urban areas, particularly violent crime. In some it's still up. But also the amenities urban areas have to offer, the restaurants, the nightlife, the cafes, the libraries, the museums. All of this creates a buzz, a factor that these creative class people are drawn to. So I think those three factors, and what happens, of course, is they're drawn into a city. It begins to change its character. It becomes more affluent. It has more amenities, and the cycle feeds on itself.
You have heard the criticisms, I'm sure, over the years, but what you're describing, there may be people listening and say, you know what, that sounds like an elitist kind of attitude. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's kind of right. The creative class is an elite group. It's highly paid. Its members make in the high 5 figures or 6 figures. They tend to be highly well-educated, and they tend to be going into urban areas. And the fact of the matter is they've been a premier force in changing those neighborhoods. So it's very interesting listening to what you said about the decay of our cities and the comeback. I'm working on a new book that I'm going to talk about when I come to visit. My new book kind of comes full cycle. It's called The New Urban Crisis. That, in fact, the success of this back to the city movement that I and others predicted some 2 decades ago, the very success of the movement of knowledge workers and creative people, yuppies back to cities, has caused housing prices to become, in many places, unaffordable for working people. The other thing that we've seen, and I think the term elitist is correct, our middle class is completely been eviscerated in America. So we have a third of our society, the creative, not just the 1%, a third of our society, the creative class doing well, while 66% of us fall further behind. And I think most importantly, as the middle class has dropped out, the great middle class neighborhoods like I grew up in New Jersey, in the city of Newark, and later in a working class suburb called North Arlington, where my mom and dad could buy a home and have an American dream on a factory worker's salary, they've been annihilated. And our society has splintered into small areas of concentrated advantage in the city and in the suburbs. In Pennsylvania, still our wealthiest areas in Pennsylvania are suburban, but much larger areas of concentrated economic distress and disadvantage. So I think, yes, the Back to the City movement has been successful, but it's actually produced a new kind of urban crisis, which is not a crisis of decay and poverty, but it's a crisis of a missing middle class, a wholly divided society.
By the way, you mentioned when you're visiting, and I just wanted to tell our listeners that Richard Florida will be speaking at Penn State Harrisburg next Wednesday, a week from today, as part of the PNC Thought Leader Lecture Series, and he is the very first speaker as part of the PNC Thought Leader Lecture Series. So, we'll get some information on our website, WITF.org, if you are interested in attending that. Something I always have to bring up, though, when we talk about that decay, and you're right. I mean, the numbers show it. You see it all the time, that even in smaller cities, that younger people, professionals are coming back to cities. But maybe what keeps more people from doing it now, you mentioned that crime is down, but schools, the quality of schools, especially once these young professionals have children, that still seems to be an issue in many cities.
So no doubt that we not only have a class divide, but we have a demographic divide. And I mentioned the people who are coming back to cities are affluent, educated, knowledge workers, and young. In fact, an urban planner at the University of Waterloo says it's not just gentrification, it's youthification. When you walk around some of these cities, they're really quite childless, or at most, I call them strollervilles. You'll see couples pushing infants in strollers, but as soon as that kid hits school age, boom, but they're not off to a conventional burb. They're off to, and I have lots of family in Michigan. These folks with the young children are off to more urban suburbs, suburbs that may have a transit connection to downtown, typically have a mixed use, what we call a mixed use downtown with restaurants and cafes and shops. So it's very interesting what people are going for and where the premium is. But I think you're right. I call it in America a barbell demography. What our cities now have are young people before, having school-age children. And then we've seen a big wave of empty nesters, people in their 50s and 60s who don't want that big house, who are saying, and of course, I think this is important to add, their kids are moving back to the city. So they're also following their kids and helping their kids. The kids are going to the bank of mom and dad to help them move to the city. So, but what's missing is families. And I think that's uniquely American. Living in Toronto, I live in an urban neighborhood in the city, but because crime is lower, and because schools are funded not by the city, but by the equivalent of the state, the province, and the urban schools are good, Toronto has families and young people and old people in the city. But I do think in the American context, unless you can afford to pay a mint for private schools, I think that the majority of people, once they have kids, go off to the burbs.
Richard Florida is an urban theorist, author, and educator, and again, he'll be speaking at Penn State Harrisburg's PNC Thought Leader Lecture Series next week. Mr. Florida, thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, it's going to be great to be back. I spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, a ton of time in Harrisburg, working on various commissions for then Governor Ridge and Governor Rendell, so it's going to be great to be back and sharing my thoughts, not just on these phenomena, but how they're affecting Harrisburg and the central Pennsylvania region and Pennsylvania in general. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. It is WITF's fall fundraising campaign, and Tim Lambert who is a central Pennsylvania institution in himself, is with us. He's WITF's multimedia news director. You ever been called an institution?
I have not. It makes me feel old.
Well, you are getting up there, Tim.
The beard is getting grayer.
I remember when you were just a young pup.
It was a fascinating conversation you just had. Always great to hear from a Pittsburgh native. And it made me think, I just picked up a book yesterday about my hometown area, Aliquippa, and how Aliquippa sort of developed as the steel town then in the bust, and how it's struggled since then, but it has this like amazing reputation for developing football players. So it sort of looks at the relationship between how football, what it means to the community now that the community sort of doesn't have its identity anymore. So it falls into what he was talking there. And
Tony Dorsett was Aliquippa, wasn't he?
Hopewell High School, but he was from Aliquippa.
Okay,
yep,
all right.
Yep. So those are the kind of conversations where if you're sitting there and you're thinking, man, I can relate to that, like that is something that you're a fan of and you want more of, and you maybe want to invest in it right now and show your support financially for Smart Talk. Make that call at 1-800-233-9483 or go to WITF.org, and those contributions can be made in monthly gifts, monthly installments of $5 a month, $10 a month. You can make a contribution of $1 a day, and it looks like we have about $320 left in the dollar for dollar match. Get in on that right now. See your gift go even further at WITF.org or 1-800-233-9483.
Tim, thank you very much for being with us today. Coming up on tomorrow's program, Janice Kaplan, and this is something that will really make you think too. The summer read this year for WITF was the book The Gratitude Diaries. Interesting book. Janice Kaplan wrote it. She's a best-selling author, TV producer, and how her life, I don't know if turn around is the way to say it, but just by expressing gratitude, that is on tomorrow's program.